directive definition and doesn't call the actual method. So you cannot simply patch the method and expect it to work. But there was only a one-liner in the IV compatibility document, and we missed it. So, in my opinion, paying attention to how we use Angular is very important. I mean, we are doing stuff like that. There are some custom decorators, for example. You know them. You are hearing about them. You are reading about them. There are a lot of famous people writing about them. So you can't miss it. If you are changing a spec like that, and that's a big change. I mean, you are changing how lifecycles work. It hasn't changed since version 2. I mean, that's a big deal. It doesn't deserve a one-liner. It deserves a big paragraph and a big blog post, maybe. I mean, it's very important. So compiler, once again, failed us. We fixed it. We have replaced the decorator, not the decorator, the operator.
You replaced the operator with the decorator from ng-neat, or
no. It's not a good solution. I think it's not good to use a decorator, custom decorator for tree shaking. Yeah, so we didn't use it. We used a custom service, and we are providing the service from the component level, at the component level. So the service lives as long as the component lives. ng on destroy is called on the service too. So whenever the service ng on destroy lifecycle hook is called, the subscription that is kept on the service is closed. That's our solution. The solution is easy. The surprise is not. Mm-hmm. Because we are working on a framework using Angular on the front end. Maybe you have heard of it, ABP framework. Mm-hmm. And that was quite a surprise for us. And it wasn't us that detected this. It was our customer. So, yeah. Not cool.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing I should say in terms of kind of going forward, definitely file these as issues, because these are like the changelog, the blog post, all those sorts of things are based on what we've heard back from the community about releases and release candidates and things like that. And so if that wasn't given appropriate attention and that hurt your project as you're doing the update, help us out. Like, come join the RC in the next cycles and give us feedback so we can fix these things. Because in general, like we hear very, very good things about our updates, where people update and kind of everything just works.
Yes.
But that clearly wasn't your case, right? Like you were significantly and materially broken. So we just ask for you to get involved and help out.
The update worked fine, and I was actually impressed with the ease of updating. It was really smooth. I even wrote about it, a blog post about how easy it is to update to Angular 10 and how marvelous I think the job you did. The only problem was about the IV failing silently. I mean, it did something, we did something else, and it didn't match. We weren't aware of it for a long time, for months actually.
Okay, now we need to start. I am going to welcome our viewer in Turkish. So, hepiniz hoş geldiniz arkadaşlar. Bugün yeni etkinliğimizde Angular ekibinden Stephen Fluin bizlerle beraber. Kendisi Angular ekibinin geliştirici ilişkileri lideri ve sözcüsü. Şöyle açıklayabiliriz: Angular'ın işte dokümanlarıyla alakalı, developerlarla ilişkileriyle alakalı, işte Angular'a gelen güncellemelerin duyurulması, tanıtılmasıyla alakalı bir ekip var. O ekibin de lead'i Stephen bizlerle beraber. Bu isteği bize Angular ekibi yaptı. Angular Türkiye ile bir etkinlik yapmak istiyoruz dediler. Biz de tabii hoş karşıladık. Ancak bu işte Covid dönemi, işte pandemi süreci boyunca İşte ertelemek zorunda kaldık sürekli. Çünkü arada bizim de planladığımız etkinlikler vardı. Öncelikle Angular ekibine, işte ekibimiz adına teşekkür ederim ilgilendikleri için. Yani biz 1,5 yıl oldu kurulalı. Sadece biraz da Angular Türkiye hakkında bilgi vereyim ilk kez gelenler için. Sadece etkinlik düzenlemiyoruz. Eğitici yazılar, videolar yayınlıyoruz. Kanalımızı takip edebilirsiniz. Ayrıca bireysel hesaplarımızda yaklaşık 30 kadar arkadaş Slack hesabımızda, bireysel Medium post, blog hesaplarımızda yazılar yayınlıyoruz. Bu kadar. Kitapta 3 tane depomuz var. Onlara star verebilirsiniz. Aslında isteriz yani star vermenizi. Şöyle bir şey olacak. 30 dakika kadar Stephen'ın bir sunumu olacak. 30 dakika sonra bir soru cevap kısmı olacak. Biz o soruları henüz Türkçe'ye çevirmedik. Cevapları da bilmediğimiz için çevirmedik. Onları umuyorum işte yayından belki bir hafta içerisinde subtitle olarak eklemiş oluruz diyorum. And hello, Stephen, again. Thank you for joining us. And,
Thank you for having me.
Okay, you're welcome. You're welcome again. And as Angular Turkey, we founded almost 1.5 years ago by the leadership of Arman Özak. And we are almost 30 Angular developers, all from Turkey. We are not just organizing events, we also really publishing educational content about Angular in Turkish, also recording video series about educational purposes again. Also, we have 3 awesome library in GitHub. If you have a time later, I'm suggesting you to check it out, our repos, which it's about Angular, all Angular world, not just about Angular Turkey. And after this speech of me, Arman Özak will be with you. And after your 30-minute presentation, 35 minutes presentation, there will be question and answers section. And we will be in touch. So Arman Özak can continue from here.
Actually, you already told everything I would say, so I don't have really much to say. Welcome again. We are really thankful to the Angular team and you for sharing your time and effort in this. We are looking forward to hearing and watching your presentation. So please proceed.
Awesome. Thank you again. Let's kind of start to dive in here. So I've shared my screen. I think someone on the StreamYard needs to hit the button. There we go. All right, so thank you so much for having me. My name is Stephen Fluin. I am a developer relations lead on the Angular team. I've been on the team for about 4 years now. And so I've actually joined Google starting on the Angular team. And I give a lot of talks on Angular. And one of the most interesting things that people keep asking me about is how the way that Google builds software has influenced the way that we build Angular and the way that Angular relates with the world. And so this is a talk that people ask me for a lot, is kind of breaking down some of the things that I've seen within Google in terms of the practices, in terms of the culture, in terms of the tooling that we are also trying to manifest on the Angular team. And so let's kind of dive in. So this is a picture of me more than 4 years ago now, starting at Google. So when you join Google, you actually do get one of these little funny hats. And even before I joined Google, I used to wear Google Glass. So I was always a little bit of a fan of the company even before joining. And I came in, and basically when you join Google, they do 2 weeks of training. So they try and teach you all the company best practices. They say, here's all the things you're allowed to do. Here's all the things you're not supposed to do from like the HR perspective and all that. And then they dive into engineering, and they talk about how Google builds software, what the processes are, what the tools are. And I was hearing these things, and I was like, that can't work, right? Like they're describing this kind of utopia of software development where there's flexibility and there's agility and you get all these benefits. And coming in from 15 years of enterprise consulting, I was like, no, it can't be that good. People don't work together this way. That's not how software works. And so as I started to get into Google, I kind of realized, wow, that Google's actually making these things work. And so I have, for the last 4 years, been trying to look at and understand what is it about Google that lets us do this, and how can the rest of the world reproduce those sorts of things? So some disclaimers here. I'm not claiming that all of Google is perfectly homogenous. There's lots of kind of exceptions to things like across the company. And I'll also say that I'm on the Angular team, and so I'm really focused on web developers, and so my perspective is going to skew that way when it comes to understanding the ecosystem. But a lot of this comes down to the idea of agility and innovation. I'm going to use those terms a lot because agility to me means this idea that you can move quickly, you can come up with an idea, get to market fast, change your mind, and really not have too many barriers in the way between you and trying to accomplish something. And I also talk about innovation because when you make agility an important thing and when you reduce friction, you're actually able to come up with more ideas, try new things, and come up with better end result than you could have otherwise. And so those are kind of going to be recurring themes across this talk. I'll talk basically in about 3 parts. So first we'll talk about the people, and then we'll talk about tools that we're using. And then lastly, I'll talk about how Angular is actually trying to manifest some of these things for everyone. So let's start off talking about people, because as we know, people are an essential part of any sort of organization. And so this is my son, Daniel. He is almost 2 years old now, and I don't trust him. I don't trust him to be not watched. I don't trust him with things that he shouldn't be around. And what I found working with a lot of companies is a lot of companies treat their employees like I treat Daniel, right, with a low degree of trust. But if you look at Google, that's a very different thing. Within Google, we have a very high degree of trust. We basically have a few principles. Everyone, from the engineering standpoint, can access everything. So you can see all of the source code, whether that's Google Gmail, whether that's Google Drive, whether that's Calendar, like whatever Google product you're thinking of, most Googlers can access that, most engineers. And then everyone can change anything. So I, as someone who is not on the Gmail team, I can send a change. I can say, hey, I would like to make this change to Gmail, and I can actually work on that change because I can see the code and I can submit that. And that it's a very interesting idea that we trust any of our employees to be kind of making these changes. But at the same time, Google has a very low degree of external trust. So we don't, at runtime or build time, use anything like a public NPM. Any licensed code that we bring in, so if we bring in some sort of open source code that is appropriately licensed, we'll actually copy that code into our repository, and then any changes to that code aren't coming and driven by the external world. They're always controlled by someone at Google. And so this gives us very high predictability, very high defense, because we don't need to worry about what happens like if NPM gets compromised. We're not just going to be arbitrarily executing code off of the web. If you look at Google's mission, it's to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think that this ends up manifesting itself when it comes to code and things within Google as well. One of the ways that this manifests is that we try and hire for roles. So when you're hiring for someone at Google, you don't actually start with the job. You start with, this person is trying to be a software engineer. This person is trying to be a UX engineer. Because at the scale that Google has and the scale and the number of people that we're bringing on, this is the only way we can actually hit that scale. Right? If you try to match every individual to their job at step 1 in the process, we wouldn't be able to hire fast enough. And so we hire people for a bunch of different reasons, for the role and not the job. This does a bunch of things. It gives you ability to move between teams, because you know that, hey, if this person's great at one, if they're not enjoying one job, they can move to another job, because we want to hire the best engineers and the best people across the company. Another thing that we do is we really focus on hiring leaders. And so this is actually an interesting thing that happens where you'll get into a meeting with a bunch of people on a team and everyone's leading, right? Everyone's taking things and owning things. But what this does, it ends up giving you a very high degree of trust and a very high degree of reliability, because when someone takes something on, you know that they're going to kind of see it through to the end and not just kind of poke at it and prod at it. One of the things that my boss said to me in 2016 when she hired me was really interesting. It was, I'm not your boss. And what she meant by that was that she is not here to come in every day, tell me I'm doing things right, tell me I'm doing things wrong, micromanage me to the nth degree, right? When I joined Google, I was expected to take ownership of problems and figure out what the most important thing to do was, and then align the organization to try and solve those problems and align to create benefit for everybody. And I think this is a really, really interesting mentality where managers are more servant leaders trying to protect, defend their team, advance their careers, and kind of shield them from kind of a lot of stuff that can go on at organizations. This is a picture of Jeremy Elborn on one of our team outings doing indoor skydiving. And I like to bring up Jeremy as an example of taking ownership of issues, because I like to complain a lot. When I run into a bug in Gmail, I just say, "Oh my God, I can't believe Gmail just did this." And one of the things I love about Jeremy is that when I complain, he doesn't just commiserate with me like a lot of people do. He always says, well, did you file a bug? Did you tell someone? What did you actually do to try and make the situation better? And if you look across Google, this is something that manifests in a lot of different ways where we're all work for the same company, and in some ways we're all responsible for the work that we're doing, and we're creating the things that we're creating together. But there's this concept of diffusion of responsibility, where if everyone is responsible for something, then no one is responsible, and no one's going to actually take care of it. And so we actually have a few ways of combating this. And so while when I see that bug in Gmail, right, because I'm in the early beta access release or whatever, I am responsible for helping, right? I cannot just sit here and complain. I have to tell someone, I have to track it, I have to go file an issue, I have to try and reproduce it, send system logs, all those sorts of things. But at the same time, I'm not responsible for fixing it, right? I'm probably not the best person to go fix a bug in Gmail, but I'm part of the solution, not the entirety of the solution. I think that's a really interesting idea. This is a picture of Igor, which I've used an app to de-age to that of a child. And one of my favorite things that Igor advocates for is this idea of transparency. Anytime on our team when someone creates a doc or a process that has anything happening in secrecy or privacy, he's always asking the question, why isn't this public? Why can't we just do this in the GitHub repository? Why can't we do this in the open world? And that is a really, really important attribute that I admire a lot. This is Minko, another person from the DevRel team. And I really feel like he is a great embodiment of user centricity, where we're not always asking the question, what do developers want? We're always looking at, okay, what do users need, right? So not just forgetting and trying to solve problems for ourselves, but trying to say, what impact is this going to have on the ecosystem? What impact is this going to have on customers? And I think that is a critical cultural thing. This is a photo from another of our team offsites, where we actually brought in a improv troupe to train us on some improv. And there's a really important concept in improv called yes and. And how yes and works is that if you're doing an improv sketch, let's say I invent an apple and I hand you an imaginary apple. If you look at that and say, no, that's not an apple, it's going to shut down the scene. If you instead say, yes, this is an apple, and I'm going to eat it, and I'm going to find all these other apples and put it back in the barrel, if you're building collaborative and you're building on what other people are doing, that's going to make the scene entertaining. It's not going to shut down. It's not going to be boring for all the participants. It's not going to be boring for the attendees. And what we see is that the exact same concept applies in business as well, where in business, it's very, very easy to say, no, I don't want to do that project. This implementation is wrong. You're doing things wrong. I got to shut that down. But if you change your mentality and you start with a culture where you trust people around you, and you start and you assume you're going to say yes, and say yes and, hey, yes, you want to do this feature, and we can make sure that that's aligned to these other efforts so that it fixes the problem for everybody. That is a far healthier way to approach a problem, and it's going to ensure that you get a lot more done. There's this concept that jokes can drive culture, and this manifests itself in a lot of different ways at Google, where we have these ideas, we have these aspirations, and one of the best ways of sharing those things and actually kind of reinforcing those is joking about them. And so we have a bunch of jokes, and I'll just call it a couple here. So one is called N+1. So this comes from our site reliability engineers, or SREs, where any system you have where you have N instances, replicas of something, you should probably have N+1, because that would be better, right? That'd be more secure. And so you can think about, what if you were trying to make toast? How would you make toast N+1? So maybe you have a plate, maybe you have a backup plate at the bottom. And so like seeing pictures and images like this, just kind of reinforcing those concepts. Another one that is hopefully a best practice that a lot of people already know about, which is that you should not try and roll your own crypto. Anytime anyone tries to do crypto or security, and you're like, oh, I'll just implement it from scratch because I know what I'm doing, you're going to do a bad job. You're going to leave holes, and you're not going to really solve the problem. And so pictures like this are funny and kind of manifest that, right? You've got a really secure gate that people can just kind of walk around. Another really important cultural thing that we do is understanding bias. We all have bias. It is a natural and healthy thing. That is the heuristics that your body and your brain are taking in millions of data points every second, and you cannot react to all of them. So your brain makes shortcuts. But understanding those shortcuts you're making and taking those biases out of decisions you're making and systems you're building is critical for making healthy, effective systems. And so there's this really great test that you can get from, I believe this is Harvard, it's Project Implicit. So you can actually measure some of your biases. So you can see, do I have a gender science bias where I think one gender is more or less associated with science, for example. And tools like this to really just understand and quantify some of those things can help act as reminders when we're building systems, when we're making important decisions, not to let those biases affect us and try and use data-driven decision-making. Shared infrastructure is a huge part of a company the size of Google, where we have lots of different pieces, we share lots of things. But in general, Google, we don't win by fiat, right? It is not a team coming to you and saying, you have to go use this. Good technology wins at Google because it's great technology, because it solves problems. And there's this natural forcing function that happens at Google where by partnering with the people in the infrastructure that you rely on via this shared infrastructure, you actually create this kind of virtuous loop where you're going to be improving the infrastructure that you're using. You're going to be able to go in and modify it if you need to. You're going to be able to solve problems. And they're going to be able to make the infrastructure better. And they're going to understand that when they make a change to that infrastructure, what effect is that having on you? And that this is a very virtuous cycle. There's lots of different types of shared infrastructure. So even if you look at, for example, a design system, right? We have a company-wide one that says, hey, here's Google's design philosophies. But if you flip that to product, for example, and I'm just realizing that I flipped this chart, but the x-axis is wrong, but because a product is going to affect fewer people, but you can have more specific results. And then if you go all the way to the team level, you're going to have even fewer devs, but you can have more and more specific shared infrastructure that is bespoke for specific problems. There's this concept out there of defensive programming, where in general, teams allocate something like 10 or 20% of their time to keeping up to date with the ecosystem. And I think this is really important to acknowledge and plan for, because as developers, whenever we build in a new dependency, it's going to save us time, it's going to make us more efficient, but there is a cost to having dependencies. If you built all the code yourself and you wouldn't have any dependencies, you wouldn't need to do any defensive programming. But this is not how things work in 2020. No one is going back and writing machine code for everything that they do, right? We have abstractions for a reason. We have these extensions for a reason. And acknowledging that if you want to continue getting the benefits of this collaboration, get the benefits of these dependencies, you have to continue to invest in those dependencies. And so that's a really important thing to acknowledge. We use lots and lots of tools for collaboration. So I'm going to dive through a few of the things that we do. There's this really great thing out there called the Agile Manifesto, which I'm a big fan of. And one of the things it says is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I see a lot of developers look at that and they nod and they say, yeah, that makes sense. And then they immediately proceed to build tools to manifest and implement that philosophy, which is just a funny thing that I like to poke at a little bit, because we do need tools along the way. But again, like having this philosophy of it is about the people, it's about our interactions more than it is about those tools. So Google has a monorepository. So that means Gmail, AdSense, Google Cloud, Google Play, all of these things are in a single source code repository. You can think of it as like a big file structure that just looks like a normal file on your disk, but it's got tons and tons and tons of code. We also, within that file structure, we have a third-party folder. And what we do is anytime we are licensing or bringing code into our repository, that code goes into third parties. Clear licensing, clear ownership. So things like Angular, Linux, GCC, all those things are in that third-party folder within Google. When we have all this code in this giant repository, builds end up becoming a big challenge. So if you want to, for example, rebuild or make a change to Angular, as needed, we will rebuild your Angular application, Angular, Node, JavaScript, GCC, the Linux kernel, anything that needs to be rebuilt gets rebuilt at the right time and at the right scale. And the only way we were able to do this is because we have this amazing build system that's actually open source called Bazel, where I think of it a little bit like Make on steroids, where the dependency chains across the entire repository are really well understood. So we know when a code change is made in one place in the repository, what and where and how we need to rebuild the rest of it. So one of the manifestations of this is that Bazel is configured by on-disk configuration files. So we've got these build.bazel files. And what this means is that the code is actually the source of the truth, not only for the execution of the code, but also for the kind of DevOps infrastructure side of the code, right? There is no way for my code to depend on someone else in the repository without explicitly declaring that in the code in those build files. And so you can look in one place and really understand the entirety of how to build and how to run and how to package code, which is really, really nice. if you contrast that to something like where maybe I in my past career, I've used Jekyll, right? Now I have this Jekyll configuration that I have to go worry about, and I have to worry about this project configuration, and I have to go worry about this library configuration. All of that is in one place. All of that's in that same repository, that same source tree, which is really, really helpful. We also have this idea of a one version policy. And so if you ever look at an Angular application that is built within Google, and you look at the ng version attribute, you're going to see 000 placeholder. And what this means is that that version of Angular is actually running off of the latest commit on GitHub. So Google does not use the majors and the minors of Angular. We use every commit to GitHub, gets synced across all Google, and is used by all of the applications. And this one version policy is really important because without it, you end up having hundreds of versions of dependencies, and there's really no way to stay up to date. There's a really great example of this where there was a few years ago a critical bug in the SSL layer of the internet called Heartbleed. And so effectively, all implementations of SSL across the world had to be fixed. And at Google, we had one version of OpenSSL that we patched. And then basically over weeks, we just redeployed all of the applications using those rebuilt artifacts. And so we fixed Heartbleed in one place, and then all of Google was patched effectively. And I've talked to other teams where we end up having all these silos. We end up having different teams that can't share code. They can't collaborate. They're not sharing dependencies. They're on different versions of dependencies. If you looked at one of those teams and asked them how long would it take you to patch every version or every project and every application out there, it would either take years or never be complete, right? Most of the projects might be turned down by the time they get fixed. And so this idea of putting all the code in one place and having only a single version that we all have to move together in lockstep forward helps a lot. But the only way to move forward like this and to actually be effective at this is to have really good validation. And so testing is essential at Google. So we have a few kind of policies that make this sane. And in general, so if I'm on the Angular team and I make a change to Angular and I break the tests for your application, I'm responsible for that. So every time we make a breaking change to Angular where we change the name of an API or something like that, we're actually responsible for fixing those thousands of applications. And so we are intimately aware of whenever we make a breaking change, and we use that validation to understand, make those things explicit and intentional. But at the same time, if I make a change to Angular and I don't break your tests, you're responsible. And so this kind of naturally creates a feedback loop where teams want to test their applications really well so that they know that they can't be broken by anyone else in the repository. So every change to Angular runs more than 70,000 test suites. So that's not 70,000 tests, that's 70,000 test suites from various applications across the code base. And so we are actually really, really confident of every release of Angular being very, very good. And one of the only ways that we can accomplish this is through automation. So when we have to update and make a breaking change across those thousands and thousands of projects, what we do is we have a tool that can look at the AST and actually make modifications to the code to make sure that it continues to work. And what we did on the Angular team is we actually took those and we've externalized those. So when you run the ng update command, what you're actually doing is you're running the same sort of code transforms that we run across all of Google to make sure that the code keeps working. So I talked about this idea that anyone can see the code, anyone can modify the code. So anyone can propose modifications, to be a little bit more clear. And so the way that I could get in and make a change to Gmail and know that things are actually sane and working is that we're dependent on those tests, right? I will know immediately and I won't be able to submit my changes if I've broken a test. And we actually do have a review process. So when you want to make a change, you propose it, and then you need 3 sign-offs. So the first is you need what's called an LGTM, or looks good to me, where you say, another engineer at the company says, yeah, I looked at this code. It looks like it's doing what it's trying to do. And it looks like generally good code overall. We have something called readability. So for each language, TypeScript, C++, Java, all those things, there are folks that are approved as reviewers of that language. Like I have X readability, so I know how the code should look for that. I know what the best practice is. I know what the standards are around that. And so you need someone to approve the code for the language you're writing in. We also have this idea of an owner's file. So anywhere in that file tree, someone can say, I own this subset, or this group owns this subset. And so you need someone from this group to approve that change. So if you're making a change that's on the same group, so you're just making a small change that only affects your team and your product, you can get a single person to give you all 3 of those checkmarks, right? They can say, hey, this looks good to me. Maybe they have readability and maybe they're in the owners. Yeah, this change looks good. It goes directly in the code base. But if I'm making a change to, for example, Gmail, that's not my project, then the owner gets to take a look at it. Someone can say this, yes, this looks good. And someone that has readability can say, yeah, this matches our standards. So those approvals allow you to make sure that the changes are always good and always intentional. In general, it's very easy to bring open source code into Google. But how it works is that if you bring code into the repository, you are now responsible for it. So you may say, hey, I've got this new reactive JavaScript library. You can absolutely bring that in, right? If it's licensed appropriately, you can bring that in. And then I now own that. I'm responsible for making sure that that stays up to date. If I need new features, I have to sync in new versions. I have to go verify it, go through the audits and things like that. And then other people can start to rely on that. But I stay responsible for it until I say, hey, I don't actually need any of these updates. Someone else can take care of them if they want them. And so the idea is that having these kind of systems and rules in place allows everyone to innovate both more and faster while still keeping things sane, right? Like we know that the entire code base builds, we know that everything is consistent, tests are passing, but we can all make changes, we can all collaborate and come up with cool ideas together. And there's some interesting kind of ways that this can go off the rails occasionally. So there's actually a day when AngularJS broke not any of our production systems, but internally the build system was the builds were failing effectively. What happened was that some Java documentation library was relying on AngularJS for rendering its Java documentation, and Java was relying on Java documentation. And so there was this kind of weird chain that meant that AngularJS broke a lot of Java builds. But what happened was we took this as a learning opportunity. We didn't blame anyone and say, hey, you did a bad thing. We said, okay, what were the systems and processes in place that allowed this to happen? And how do we fix the systems so that this doesn't happen again? And so we had this idea of blameless postmortems, which I absolutely love, because if you remove the concept of blame and you remove the individual mistakes from it, you make a much healthier thing, and people are much more willing to come together and say, hey, how do we design a system that's going to work and be resilient and keep going forward? So we actually take this even further and we celebrate failures. So there's a quarterly email that I get of actually celebrating things that we've messed up. So like, hey, a data center went down for an hour, or some configuration change propagated wrong. We generally don't end up having any sort of consumer impact, but we see these things internally, and we acknowledge them, and we try and use these as moments to do better. Because if we're not even aware of these things, if our failures are secret, then we can never institutionalize that knowledge and make things better. We have this concept of approved languages. There's a relatively short list, and so there's a process to add new ones, like we added TypeScript, but all of this is really supported on, or focused on, the supported path. So it's not necessarily taking away the ability to like do other things, but there's a lot of tooling. There's a lot of people that are working towards making these things easy and like automatically integrate into the build system. Code health tools, all those sorts of things make these things easier to use. One of the things we have is code search. So this is actually open source. So if you take a look at the Bazel code search, which is just public, it's using some of the same tools that we use in Google, and where you can actually like hover over a type definition and click on it and see the definition and find references and do all this like kind of very cool inline thing that you actually need to interact with a code base the size in our modern repository. Some of this exists, I think, via cloud source repositories that were a product on Google Cloud. I haven't checked in on this in a little while. There's another tool that we use called Kite. So this is, again, open source. You can take advantage of this. But this is, for example, within that code search, we go and we annotate HTML templates. And we say, okay, hey, just like we do in the language service, we can figure out where does this HTML refer to, so that you can click on it and you can go back to the TypeScript. We use Kite to do that, so that you have this extra layer of information across the code base. A lot of policies at Google are signs, not a cop. So I love this picture from The Simpsons, where a lot of these things aren't enforced. They're not mandated. They're just, hey, you should do this, right? And then we trust individuals to, if they're deviating, they probably have a good reason for this. And so we have things like inline warnings and reminders. So if I am trying to bring code into that third-party folder, for example, there'll be a little pop-up and says, hey, just a reminder, if you're trying to do this, here's the process for doing this. And so giving people contextual information around the right thing to do so they can make the right choice instead of just having to go through extra hoops. I should also acknowledge that launches are very different from development. Launches are more restricted at Google. So while being able to write code and make changes to the code base is very, very loose, launches require things like privacy, sign-off, security, because we want to make sure that we don't do the wrong thing for the users. And so it's really actually a cool process to participate in, because let's say you want to ship a new product and you want support. This is how you get it. You go through a process that gets lawyers to look at your privacy policy. It gets security experts to look at the security of your application. It gets privacy experts to make sure that you're handling user data and building user trust. So it's really cool to have this whole group of people aligned to what you're trying to accomplish. So Google, obviously, with anyone being able to make changes, we move very fast as a code base. So how do people keep up? And there's a few kind of funny manifestations of this. in every bathroom at Google, and I haven't seen this in a few months because it's due the work from home for COVID, but in every bathroom stall, in every bathroom urinal, there are signs that have information and best practices. So one of them is called testing on the toilet. And this kind of normalizes behaviors across the company and gives people shared ideas of like, hey, what is the best practice around testing? What is the best practice around mental health? And really tries to take advantage of these things during our downtime. Open source and platforms are critical to the success of a lot of different companies. One of my favorite quotes is that there are more smart people outside your company than in it. And I think that's even true when you work at a huge company like Google, where we have a lot of really, really, really smart people. And then I often say to our team, stop hiring our best people, because on the Angular team, we have this amazing ecosystem of really intelligent, capable individuals. And oftentimes when we're hiring, we look to those individuals. But I hate getting in the way of people that are doing amazing things in the community. Some people think that open source is like a silver bullet that just kind of solves problems. But I like to pivot that a little bit. Open source in general costs more than not being open source. But what you get out of that is you get higher quality. You solve problems, and you get to learn about needs before you even need them. So this is something I see at Google, where Angular solves problems for the open source world before Google even needs some of these things. And then they say, oh, Google say, hey, I need that feature. Great, you already have it, and I'm going to go use that. Open source also can give you an ecosystem where by coming together and building shared collaborations, we can all help. So last, I want to just talk really briefly about Angular and how Angular is trying to manifest some of these concepts in the external world. So we actually have a model for this monorepository concept outside of Google. So if you look in the Angular repository, you're going to see packages. You're going to see all of kind of the sub packages that we build on NPM. We're using Bazel to do all of this. So we try and do that. So we're trying to export some of these great Google patterns to the world. So Bazel, as I said, is an example of, we use that in our repository. Bazel can be very hard to set up, but it's amazing and has a really positive impact if you're able to do it. When we generate new projects in Angular, we give you testability out of the box. We're going to give you tests. We're going to say, hey, you should be doing this. This is a best practice. Angular focuses a lot on things like accessibility, internationalization. We use this idea of third party. We use this idea of evergreen, only having one version. That's why we try and keep all of our versions in sync so that the code keeps working together, and we push everyone forward as an ecosystem. We do a lot of integration testing, and one of the things that we actually tried doing was we said, hey, if you're able to set up and run a continuous integration server and actually just use our latest commit to master, send us your build failures and let us know where we're breaking you. So we're always trying to look for ways of getting more validation of releases and more validation of every single commit. And another project we have around this is called NGCC validation, where we've actually checked in hundreds of projects using libraries so that we can run this integration test and actually figure out when we're breaking other people's libraries. And so if you want to be part of that validation suite, check out this repository and add yourself, add your project, add your library, so that we get notified when we break something even before we cut a release. So in general, we're really trying to help teams build like the best of Google and trying to manifest all those best practices, because when you have the right people and the right tools, there's no limit to what you can accomplish. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. That was an amazing presentation.
Yeah, hopefully it helped people.
Yeah, certainly.
I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. So should we just get to the Q&A part?
Sure. Yeah. Let's dive into Q&A.
Yes, there was some question from YouTube, and I would like to ask this before our questions from Ahmet Dursun. Sure. Can you see the comment in your screen, Stephen? If it's possible,
sure, yeah, I can see it. So is it what kind of test selection algorithm do you use to run that 70,000 plus test suites? In general, how Bazel works is that everything can be scaled. So we don't actually run tests locally on the machine. We run it in a cloud. And so we can actually parallelize it. And so generally we run all of the tests, or if not all of it, like if not all the tests, then we use a blueprint. But basically, to my knowledge, and I'm not actually in the DevOps side of this, we run all of the tests at Google that like are affected by changes to our build targets every day, basically. So we're running them all.
Okay. Okay. About
Was there any other question? I think
no,
not,
there
right?
are any other question about it, and many people like the presentation of you. Also, I think we can move on to our question, starting by you, Benjamin.
Okay. So, Stephen, thank you for your presentation again. You mentioned that Google employs monorepo architecture, right? Everything you have lies within single repo. Also, you mentioned that there are third-party folder that you pull in from third party, and Angular is also hosted on GitHub. So, when you wanna commit a new piece of code, what do? Do you push the two repositories, or like when there's a new pull request coming from outside of Google? How do you keep these two places in sync?
Sure. So GitHub is the source of truth. And so every commit to Angular, every PR goes through our GitHub repository. And then what we do is we synchronize that every commit back into Google. And so that synchronization process is the thing that goes through that kind of checklist of like, do we have a looks good to me? Do we have a the right validation that this code is good?
Okay.
So you also mentioned about the security measures that you're taking about the code that enters Google. You said we don't simply get outside code into Google. We are copying it, and we have code owners, we have code reviews, etc. How do you accomplish a new pull request for Angular repository? Because Angular also powers up several of your applications. And someone came up with a new pull request, and it requires a new dependency. How are you managing this?
Sure. If someone sends a pull request that pulls in a new dependency, that would be a huge, meaningful change, and it would get a lot more review than basically any other change. Because we try very hard to keep our dependency chain minimal. So like if you ignore the Angular CLI for a second, which runs in a different context and has different security implications, Angular itself has minimal third-party dependencies.
Okay.
Right. We rely on TypeScript. We rely on RxJS. We rely on Zone.js, which is a project that we're leaders for. I don't remember offhand if there are other dependencies, but it's a very, very minimal list, and so that would be a completely different. If you said, "Hey, let me go rely on, I don't know, Moment or Lodash," right? Like that would be a bunch of work.
So, do you have a copy of TypeScript in Google?
Yeah, we have a copy of. I mean, we via the appropriate licensing, we synchronize repositories into our code base so that nothing changes without our knowledge.
Okay.
I also have a question. I see in your presentation you mentioned many times about Bazel, but with Angular 10, Bazel schematics is deprecated. And what are the reasons behind of this decision? I mean, why did you decided to deprecate Bazel schematics?
Yeah, so Bazel, or at Angular/Bazel, that package was our attempt or our experiment around what if we used Bazel as a builder within the Angular CLI. So when you ran ng build, we then invoked Bazel to then manage and execute the compilation. This required a whole bunch of work that didn't make sense to Angular developers. And it also doesn't actually look like what we do at Google. So what we've done is we deprecated that package, and we've made a bunch of improvements with the Bazel team. So you don't actually need that package anymore. So how it generally works now, and what our recommendation is if you want to go and set Bazel up in your build system, great. That is what Google does. That is what the Angular team does. That will absolutely work for you. And your Bazel setup and installation can actually just call into the Angular CLI to do builds. So it's kind of the inversion control. Instead of the Angular CLI bringing in Bazel, Bazel should be bringing in the Angular CLI.
Okay, so there are no deprecation. There will be just merging with Angular CLI, as far as I understand. With the Bazel skill, there will be in Angular CLI, because it was announced by Angular, Bazel schematics, and all Bazel support. And when I see with Angular 10 it was deprecated, I was kind of I was kind of confused. Is Angular backing up the support of Bazel or not? But I also know the people developing framework also with Bazel schematics. This is why I believe it was important to continue support.
So the Angular CLI no longer has any code in it that is Bazel aware, and we don't have this schematic or builders for that anymore because we don't need them, right? Bazel now is able to execute node binaries as part of the Bazel build system, and so Angular doesn't need to know about Bazel to work great with it.
Okay.
Talking about the build systems, I would like to.
There are a couple of questions from the chat.
Chat, yes.
Should we take questions from chat and then continue with our questions?
Yes. Can you see the latest question from Mustafa?
I can. What about ordered tests? How do you handle that case? So, I mean, I think this is a relatively standard thing. So, like, if you have an Angular application that has a spec file where it's got a bunch of tests that rely on some setup and the tests have to execute in order, that set of tests will execute as a unit. So that will execute on one CPU, one machine, in a shared context. Also,
are there any early access mechanism for? Okay, another question from Kubilay Kara.
There are no internal beta tests. Like as I said, all development on Angular happens in our GitHub, and so if you want early access to new features in the same way that like Google uses in production, you just check out the latest commit, and that is the latest version of Angular. So everything we do is public.
Yes, it's already public. Another question by Lutfi Öz. Is there any micro front-end apps in Google built by Angular? Of course, but...
So that is a complicated question about whether or not there are micro front-end apps, because it depends on your definition of micro front-end. I mean, the answer is kind of. So if you look at, for example, the Firebase console, that is a great example of an Angular application that has multiple kind of sub applications within it. So each of those sub applications theoretically is like a micro front-end being loaded by a shell, but they aren't accessed directly. So again, it depends on your definition of micro front-end. There's also cases where you basically get one application per entry point. So if generally what people are looking for when they ask for micro front-ends are independent deployability, so that you can deploy one part of the application without deploying everything. And that is a very complex topic and very nuanced, but it's something that a monorepository actually helps with a lot, because in a monorepository, you don't have to redeploy everything, because you can ensure you know what you're changing and what needs to be redeployed when you make a change to the platform.
Does Angular support this? Sorry, Levent, I interrupted. Go ahead. Sorry.
Before you referred to some build system, and Angular has actually a custom build system, because now can build your own builders, right? In Angular, and people actually did that. There are a lot of community projects and third-party projects that you can use right now. Is there any plan to integrate some of them or new ones in Angular itself? And when is it meaningful to create our own one?
So the first question is when would we integrate someone else's builder into Angular? In general, we don't know what problem that would be solving. We don't feel like we need to. A really great example of this is NGX Build Plus, which is from Manfred Steyer. That is a fantastic extension that we recommend anyone that's doing anything with custom elements, anyone that needs to take control of their Webpack build, use. So that exists. That is an independent project that we really love and we recommend. It would almost be against kind of the open source philosophy to try and take that project over and integrate it into the Angular ecosystem. So what we try and do is we try and make it really easy to plug other people's code in, because this is one of the things that we care about kind of for the long run, is making Angular more extensible so that we don't have to own everything. So if there's a reason you want those things integrated into Angular and not just one command away by like an ng add command, let us know, because then we can always consider and look at those things. And then I think your second question is, when should you build your own builders? we find that probably 90% of developers don't need to build any sort of builder. But if you're in the 10% where you want to take control of some part of your build system, yeah, definitely do a builder. Like that is why we created those APIs. That is why we created that system.
So you were asking, Benjamin?
Yes.
So I was going to ask a follow-up question on micro frontends. So does Angular support this out of box? We know that Angular has first-class support for monorepo. You can create applications and libraries within a single project, but can you deploy it independently? And how you put them together in production? Can we do this without?
This is not a use case that we have supported out of the box. There's a lot you can do today with like Webpack externs, but you're doing a lot of the work. And I mean, one of the biggest problems here is that someone has to guarantee that the changes in one part of your application don't break the rest of the application. You end up getting into an inconsistent state, which in my opinion is a bit of an unsolved problem where like you can solve it, but you have to do it based on the changes in the teams you've got. What I will say is we're spending a lot of time looking at things like Webpack 5 and Module Federation as more clear solutions to some of those problems. And so this is something we get asked about a lot. I think 2021 is going to be the year of micro frontends where everyone, like we actually have, as an ecosystem, a clear vision, a clear like approach that makes sense for these things.
Okay,
it's very easy with independent deployability and micro frontends to shoot yourself in the foot or end up with a bunch of like silos.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
I have another question about static site generation. I know Angular version 9 has pre-rendering capabilities, but I also know Angular not built for crafting static sites. But do you have any plan to invest on Jamstack, that kind of popular things? Have you any plan to build some tools maybe to support static site generation like Jamstack, like Succulent maybe?
Yeah, so we actually talk to the Scully team a lot, like almost every week. One of the things that we did in, I forget which version it was, but we actually added pre-rendering to Angular Universal. So I think server-side rendering is a thing that a lot of companies are doing, and like now is the time to do it. We have really good tools for it. Like I mentioned how micro frontends or 2021 is going to be year of micro frontends. This year is the year of server-side rendering and pre-rendering. So like we have support for it in the Angular Universal project. So it's relatively easy to add. We've got a much better developer experience than we used to have there. And we're really glad things like Scully exist because it takes a different approach, right? Like Angular Universal, you have to make sure that all of your code is executable in a node context, which means that we can be very fast and we can pre-render your site like almost instantly. But you've got this uncanny valley of JavaScript. Whereas Scully, they take the kind of puppeteer browser-based approach, which is much, much slower, but you know it's going to work. If it works for users and it works for browsers, it's going to work with Scully.
Another question from YouTube, from Gökhan İpek. What would you like to answer for this question?
Google has a tendency of killing apps in a short notice period of time. Does it put a pressure on developers as a whole? I will only respond to this talking about Angular because that's the space that I'm in. We try to give people lots of notice when we do things. So we have this deprecation policy that we follow. If you remember, like AngularJS hit maturity, and we put out like a 3-year timeline for LTS. We've actually been receiving a bunch of requests to extend that recently, which we're considering. And so I think in general, Angular does a really good job of communicating with developers and giving them a long timeline and not forcing change on people. I mean, if you look at the Ivy change, right, we could have just deployed Ivy as a breaking change and dropped support for the past, but we didn't. We said, hey, we're going to release Ivy, and now we're going to give people time to make sure their apps work before we enforce it on you, and then we'll remove the old code. So we totally believe in this idea that Angular needs to move the ecosystem forward together. And we think we've actually been very successful at that. Like we've been doing this for 4+ years now, making kind of these long-term promises of stability and continuity and keeping them.
Another question from the same guy, Gökhan İpek.
Do I have a feature I was really excited about in the last 6 to 12 months? I have a whole bunch of features that I'm a really big fan of. One of the changes that I think was really great. I mean, this might have been 6 to 12 months ago, but just our continual focus on staying up to date with the ecosystem. And so I'll give 2 examples of that. One is staying up to date with TypeScript. So like this idea that you always get the latest version of TypeScript with the latest version of Angular, I think is really good. So that again, we're keeping, just like you do at Google, we're keeping up to date with the ecosystem. You get the latest features, you get like the new tuple typing features that were launched, optional chaining, all those sorts of like great things. But then also looking at things like differential loading, right? Like the browser support that we need to ship with today by default is different than the one we needed 4 years ago. And so trying to push the world into making good choices here, I think has been helpful.
By following that, I have a question for it. Input as an observable proposal, as it's known for five years, it's still in the proposal phase. One of the most anticipated features. Is there going to be implemented anytime soon?
So I don't know about, so there's both an observable proposal in TC39 as well as another proposal in the, Wattwig group, trying to add it to the HTML spec. I don't know the status of either of those. I haven't checked in super recently on either of those, but I think it would be beneficial to the ecosystem to have observables, but at the same time, with things like RxJS, we don't strictly need them, right? Like it would be better if it was a native browser feature, I think, because like we have promises, and promises don't have these same sort of features, and the language keeps getting better and better. So I think observables would be valuable personally, but we're not waiting for that.
So if the native observable support, it's a proposal in ECMAScript also. If it comes to browsers as a native, are you going to change that dependency of RxJS to native one?
So anytime a feature that Angular relies on becomes a standard, we want to use the standard version. That is our explicit intent. So like one that has been having a ton of discussion around right now is decorators, right? Decorators are a proposal. They're implemented by TypeScript. We rely on them heavily. We see more and more JavaScript and web developers relying on decorators. The way that decorators get standardized might not be the same syntax that we use, right? Like we say @decorator export class. What if it was, for example, export @decorator class, right? That would be a crazy, like huge change for the whole ecosystem. But if that's what the standard is, we would probably build automatic migrations to move everyone to the new standard.
So Angular 10 was a modest but very stable release. I mean, it was easy to migrate to it. It was almost a few minutes of work, and it just worked. So we loved it, actually. But what should we expect from version 11 and beyond? I mean, people are really excited for new features, and what should we expect?
Sure. So in general, the Angular team, we're very, very invested in a time-based release. So you should expect a version 11 in the fall. I cannot tell you what will be in it right now. I can tell you some of the things that we are thinking about and working on. And I will also say it is our intention and plan to share more of the things we're working on and more of the roadmap very, very soon. So I know that during the kind of Ivy development period, we went a little bit silent because we were just working on Ivy for so long. But now that we're starting to be past that, we really do want to do a better job of that. And one of the things that you're going to see a ton of investment on our side is issues and PRs. So we dramatically ramped up our investment there. And so you should see that like most of the issues now have been triaged, where we're trying to see trends across the ecosystem. And then at some point, you're going to start seeing issue counts start to go down, PR count start to go down. So what you'll see in 11, again, depends on what the team gets done and also what happens in the ecosystem. Just some of the top of mind things are TypeScript 4. It's coming out. So that's a big change. Webpack 5, if that comes out, if that's ready. There's a lot of innovation going on in ecosystems like RxJS that we want to stay up to date with and stay aligned with. There are a bunch of improvements and kind of steps that we want to do to kind of help us start moving beyond NGCC. So getting everyone over to Ivy, not only from the application side of things, but from the library side of things. But I can't guarantee on any of these things what the timing is going to be.
Okay. Thanks.
Akif, I think we missed one question.
We missed a question. Actually, we are running out of time. We also have a question, but I would like to share that last two questions. One, it's just on the video. Can you see?
Sure. So how much Angular? Some people say Angular's complex framework to start with.
It's a common thing. Mostly from the beginner side, people.
Yep. No, we've definitely heard this piece of feedback. I think the difference is, or some of where that comes from, is that Angular is a batteries included kind of complete platform. And so when a beginner starts getting into Angular, they think they need to learn everything. And that is wrong. You can be an expert in Angular with having never touched Universal. You can be an expert in Angular without never having used built your own custom builders. And so one of the things that we're working on is helping developers feel successful sooner. Because if you know how to build components and you know how to compose them and communicate across them and you know how to build services and use dependency injection, you're probably pretty good at Angular without needing to know all of the other kind of long tail of features that we have.
But also, I believe there are some barriers like TypeScript, RxJS.
Yeah, no, and some of those are intentional choices, right? Like we've heard that Angular, once you learn Angular, you actually become a better developer because we've kind of forced you into these best practices. And that's one of the things that is intrinsic to Angular of we want to set you up to do things in the right way that's going to scale versus letting you do it. Like we don't have a mode of Angular that just lets you do everything wrong. And then you have to rewrite your app when you scale up.
Yes. Another question from Jem Salam.
All right. When developing internal improvements for Angular, do times come when you review as a team how different frameworks approach? Absolutely. We pay a ton of attention to the ecosystem. We actually believe that a rich, diverse ecosystem of JavaScript tools and approaches is really valuable for developers. And so we are really happy it exists. We're really happy. And we always look for collaborations. Like for example, we worked with the React team a little bit, for example, on a scheduler API proposal and some like changes to dev tools on how you could like manifest performance tracing. So we are always looking for how could we collaborate? How could we look for like better ways of doing things? And I have to go very, very soon. So this is the last question. Are significant breaking changes waiting for us in the new versions? No. I mean, we have to maintain more than 2,000 Angular applications at Google. Things will break. Like we will break things just like we have in the past. I feel very bad for even at the beginning of the call, as you heard, we were sharing some of the challenges and frustrations from the version 9 and version 10 changes in Ivy. So there will be breaking changes, but there's no significant like overhauls coming that are going to make you rewrite your entire code base.
Okay, Stephen. One last question from Fatma. I believe she has a question.
Hello. This is the last one, I think. I would like to ask about the situation of TestLint. You know, it is deprecated now, and Angular rely on TestLint. What will be expected in close future? And also, developers are using different E2 testing tools like Cypress or Puppeteer. They are more popular than Protractor. Will there be any change in the future about Protractor?
So in both of these things, our top concern is making sure that there's a consistent story where we don't leave developers behind. I think that the team is fairly confident that ESLint is the future. And so we're just working on figuring out how do we move all of these millions, billions of tests that developers have over to ESLint, because it is not a one-to-one. You just swap it out and it works. And so we're trying to figure out how do we move there without leaving people behind. And I think the same thing is true with testing, where Cypress is really cool, Jest is really cool, but we can't just switch people and just kind of break everything and ask everyone to rewrite their code. And so that's kind of the fundamental challenge for us.
Yeah. We are also using Protractor, by the way.
Awesome. Well, I have to run. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for the questions. This was all fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out to us, and thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye. Akif biz bir toparlarız.
Biz bir Stephen'la şöyle anlaşmıştık. Yani anlaşmıştık dediğim hani yaklaşık 5 dakika kadar bir etkinliği olacaktı. Çünkü işe gitmeden önce katılacağı bir toplantıydı bu etkinlikte.
Evet.
Buradaki soruları yani yakın zamanda çevirmeye çalışırız. Bizim sorularımızı, sizin sorularınızı. Subtitle olarak eklerim ama bütün sunumu çevirmek gerçekten zaten 10 dakikası Google'u anlatıyor. Google'un nasıl çalıştığını anlatıyor. Neden ihtiyaç duydular bunları, onları anlatıyor. Yani orası da bambaşka bir konu. Ama bence güzel bir etkinlikti. Bu kadar. Sizin söyleyecekleriniz varsa.
Bence de çok güzel oldu. Angular takımdan birinin geldi direkt içeriden bize bilgiler verdi bir nebze. İnşallah başkalarını da getiririz. Pardon
Aslında
Fatma böldüm sizi.
Yok. Aslında şey çok hoş yani onların bize ulaşıp bir şeyler yapabiliriz demesi çok hoş. Çünkü aslında hani Türkiye'deki developerları çok da frameworklerin evlerinden umursuyor gibi değiller genellikle. O yüzden çok teşekkür ederiz.
Evet, bu bakımdan gerçekten Angular ekibi hani bize birkaç kez bu teklifte bulundular. Dediğim gibi bu pandemi sürecinde ertelemek zorunda kaldık. Bizim planlarımız vardı. Onlarla uyuşmadı. Ramazan oldu, bayram oldu derken bugüne kadar kaldı. Belki bir sonraki etkinlikte de böyle biri gelse, Angular ekibinden olabilir ya da meşhur biri olabilir Angular dünyasında ya da JavaScript dünyasında. Ona böyle daha free bir talk yapsak sanki iyi olur gibi. Mesela şeyi konuştuk işte proposalları, işte observable'ların işte native olarak support edilip edilmeyeceğine dair. Bence gayet hani faydalı bir yöne gidebilir böyle bir şey yaparsak.
Evet,
yani aklımızda bizim birileri var sonraki etkinlikler için. Sizi de ararsa fikirlerinizi aramıza bekleriz. Akif şimdi zaten Slack kanalını vesaire paylaşır.
Evet.
Aramıza katılmak isteyenler için.
Bu arada hazır böyle bir ortam bulmuşken buradan da söyleyelim. Eğer ki hani Angular'la ilgili bir sunum yapmak isteyen herhangi bir arkadaşımız varsa bize ulaşsın. Ulaşmak kolay. Twitter'dan veya işte YouTube'dan veya başka bir yerden bize her zaman ulaşabilirsiniz. Çok severek yaparız böyle bir şeyi yani.
Evet.
Bir saat kısa oldu ama şimdi yani soru bombardımanı oldu birazcık. Yani arda yapıştırarak.
Evet.
Yani bir saat içinde...
Esas kritik soruyu soramadık ama Bünyamin.
Evet onu soramadık.
Off the record konuştuk ama
Evet.
onu biraz yapmak
Evet.
olmaz ama soramadık yani soruyu.
Soruyu
Aslında sorduk.
burada soralım mı?
Aslında sorduk, cevabımızı da aldık ama
Bünyamin,
burada söylemek bize düşmez. O yüzden
yok
Evet.
değil ama
saklı
ne
kalsın.
sormak düşünüyorduk. Yetmedi süre sormaya. Ne diyorsun Bünyamin? Sen bir açıkla istersen. İzleyenler var. Belki bilmeyenler var.
Yani tamam açıklayalım. Sonuçta public olarak bilinen bir şey. Bundan birkaç ay önce eski birkaç senedir Angular takımında olmayan bir arkadaş tarafından Angular'a açık mektup yazıldı. Angular takımın içinden işte bir sıkıntılar olduğuna, takımın kendi arasında bazı sıkıntılar olduğuna dair iddialarda bulundu. Ve son yıllarda da bayağı ünlü kişiler de Angular takımından ayrıldı. Tabii ki hala çok iyi insanlar var. Hala çok iyi developerlar var. Ama sıkıntılı ayrılanlar olduğu da söylendi. Bazıları buna destek çıktı, bazıları karşı çıktı. Böyle community şu anda biraz çorba olmuş durumda. Son günlerde özellikle Angular takımıyla, GDE programıyla alakalı bazı yazılar yayınlandı. Biz de bunu sorduk. Aslında yayına başlamadan önce birazcık erkenden alıp. Tabii ki çok fazla Google'ın içerisini ilgilendiren bir şey olduğu için çok fazla yorumda bulunamadı ama söyledi. Yani ayrılan o yazıları yazan kişiler birkaç sene önce ayrıldı. Yani o zaman onların deneyimi farklı olmuş olabilir. Takım tabii ki şu anda farklı bir yönetim var. Daha iyiye gidiyor her zaman. Daha iyisini yapmaya çalışıyorlar. Yani birazcık bizi rahatlatan cevaplar verdi açıkçası. Biz de birazcık endişeliydik Angular hakkında. Öyle bir şey. Bunu soracaktık ama vaktimiz yetmedi. Ama söylediği şeyler de zaten bunlardı yani. Hani bunun dışında çok fazla bir şey yorumda bulunamıyor doğal olarak. Ben muhtemelen söyleyemediği şeyler de vardır.
Bir de benim kendi görüşümü söyleyeyim. Biz zaten daha önce de konuştuk ama yani Google gibi büyük şirketlerde mesela Facebook'ta geçtiğimiz aylarda bir ekipte taciz davası çıktı. Kadının biri taciz edilmiş. İşte müdürü tarafından. Hani böyle şeyler bence oluyor yani. Hani tabii ki doğal değil. Ya da psikolojik baskı uygulanabiliyor ekiplerde. Sanki Angular komünitesi bunu biraz yaptı yani biraz sahiplendi. Çünkü o konuyu anlatan kişi işte NX'in de Narwhal'ın da kurucusu. Yani Angular dünyasında yeri olan biri, bilinen biri, emeği olan biri. Hani o anlatınca bir anda böyle bütün komünitenin konuştuğu bir şeye dönüştü. Ben yani Yani Angular ekibini ya da Google'u eleştirecek bir şey çıkaramıyorum buradan. Çünkü bunlar bence her şirkette olan durumlar. Yani orta ve büyük ölçekli her şirkette olan, işte kariyer savaşları mı desen ya da ona benzer, sevmiyorsun bir şeyini onu mu desen, artık bunlar var yani hayatımızda. O yüzden buradan yani Angular'ı eleştirmek bana mantıklı gelmiyor.
Bak Bora Kaşmer'in bir tane yorumu olmuş. Onu aşağıya koy bak, tam şey gibi.
Dedikodu zaten. Aynen.
Aynen. Dedikodudan ziyade aslında biraz herkesin merak ettiği bir konuydu. Kendi içimizde çok tartıştık. Çok işte haklı düşünceler de var. Bir kısım insan hani bir şeyler ters gidiyor diyor. Bir kısım insan da her şey yolunda diye düşünüyor. Ben daha çok şeyle ilgileniyorum mesela. Yani sonuca bakarım. Angular hala bütün frameworklerden daha iyi mi? Evet. Angular 10'a geçmek çocuk oyuncağı mıydı? Evet. 11 ile ilgili çok büyük beklentilerimiz olmak zorunda mı? Hayır. O kadar ileride ki daha yeni feature çıkartmasalar 2 sene umurumda olmaz yani, öyle söyleyeyim. Söylemeye çalıştığım şey şu, çok da güzel bir mesaj verdi açıkçası Stephen. Dedi ki biz issue'ları çözmeye, yani birikmiş issue'lar var. Bunları çözmeye ciddi bir kaynak ayırdık. Bu bence çok önemli bir şey, çünkü elimdeki aracın mükemmel çalışması yeni özellikler olmasından daha önemli benim için. Dokümantasyonu da ilerletirler, işte şeyi de daha güzel yaparlar. Yeni issue'lara yer açılır biraz yani. Çünkü ben gelip baktığımda 2700 civarı bir issue ile karşılaştığımda yenisini açasım gelmiyor. Yani nasıl olsa bakamayacaklar. Öyle bir durum var.
Muhtemelen zaten açılmıştır ya.
Hayır, açılmamış. İşin garip tarafı, bugün baktım bir konuyla ilgili. Zaten şeyden önce de konuştuk biraz, biliyorsun. Açılmış bir issue yok bununla ilgili. Hani issue da açayım, PR da açayım falan diye düşündüm. Ama yani ona sıra gelene kadar 1 milyon tane şey var. O yüzden çok sevindim açıkçası. Yani Angular 11 ile ilgili deseydik ya uçacağız kaçacağız, bu kadar sevinmezdim yani.
Açmasın abi, yok uçmaya kaçmaya gerek yok.
Evet.
Tabii korusun.
Hatta şey dedi bir tane team lead'lerden bir tanesi, kasten hiçbir şeye cevap vermiyor. Twitter account'u bile yok. Sadece takımı daha iyi yapmakla ilgileniyor. Hiçbir şeyle ilgilenmiyor dedi. Adını da duymadınız, hiç bilmiyorsunuz bile dedi.
Vay be, süper. Onu ben kaçırdım öyle dediğim.
Evet.
Yani,
evet. Bir IV sindirelim.
Yeni şey de güzel. Yeni yorum da güzel. Kesinlikle katılıyorum yazmış. Benim var mı?
Evet, çok eski işler var. Eski PR'lar var. Uzun zamandır bekleyen şeyler var. İlla ki tabii ki yani onların da eksik olduğu noktalar var ama halihazırda oldukça güzel bir framework. Güzel bir developer experience sunuyor.
Yani 2700 tane iş var. Tabii bunlar duplicate olanlar var vesaire. Ama bu işi çözme hızı iyi değil Angular'ın gerçekten. Hep eleştirilen yer bu. O en son Lars'ın yazdığı yazıda da eleştirdiği şey o. Bir de public roadmap'in olmaması. Bence var aslında. Hani belki iyi dokümante edilmemiş olabilir ama işte nereden baksan 2-2,5 yıldır söyleniyor. Ivy gelecek. Ivy şöyle olacak, böyle olacak. 2019 Haziran'dı yanlış hatırlamıyorsam. Ivy'yi kullandırmaya başladılar. İnsanlar test etti, denedi, gördü. Yani biraz herkesin ihtiyacı farklı. Herkes o açıdan değerlendiriyor. Adam işte public roadmap yok demiş. Yani bu yüzden kızıyor. Ki var, ben girdiğimde görüyorum yani. Belki o çok daha detaylısını görmek istediği için işte 20 sayfa eleştiren yazı yazmış. Başka konularda tabii ekleyerek.
Ya şimdi tabii şöyle bir durum da var. Burada bu işin magazin boyutunu bir tarafa bırakalım. Herkes her şeyden memnun olmak zorunda değil. Yani Angular'ın sevmediğin tarafları da olur. Bu aynı şey React'te de olur, Vue'da da olur. Yarın Svelte de olur. Daha çok genç. Ama hepsinde illaki sevmediğin bir şeyler karşına çıkar. Burada önemli olan şey şu, niyet. Ve ortada çok güzel bir araç var. Bunu daha da güzel hale getirmek. Niyetse ben bunu desteklerim.
Evet, kesinlikle katılıyorum. Bize sorusu olan var mı? Stephen gitti ama belki bize sorusu olan vardır.
Bize ne soracaklar Benjamin, Allah'ın seversen.
Doğru diyorsun abi.
Steve'la sormayan bize mi soracak şimdi?
Olaysız dağılalım bence. Abim dediği gibi. Olaysız dağılalım.
Evet, olaysız dağılalım.
Twitter, Slack kanallarından bize ulaşabilirsiniz. Kitabı da repolarımızı likelayabilirsiniz. Onu bir daha söyleyeyim. Starlayabilirsiniz. Son Bora abinin bir yorum var. Büyük takımlarla orta ve büyük ölçekli projenin geliştirme Angular bence çok başarılı. Evet.
Kesinlikle. Evet, kurumsal hayata güzel oturuyor, güzel uyuyor. Güzel standartları var. Yani en azından incelemenizi tavsiye ederiz. Hiç kullanmadıysanız kullananlar zaten biliyor özellikle.
O zaman izleyen herkese de çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
İyi akşamlar dileriz.
İyi akşamlar herkese.
Sonraki etkinliğimize yine bekleriz.
Herkes sağlıklı kal. Hoşçakalın.
İyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar. Bay bay.
akşamlar.